Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Question of Standing, The History of the CIA, by Rhodri Jeffries Jones, narrated by Roger Clark. Preface. Cold air blasted into the vestibule of the Harrington, cushioning the hotel's air-conditioned interior. Pushing outward on its doors, I plunged into the August humidity. Some 20 minutes later, I was at the Neptune Saloon, close to the Capitol and the Library of Congress. The Admiral's daughter had taken a break from dancing on the bar top. Clients relaxed. At least for a while she would not, as was her custom, leap unnervingly into an unsuspecting lap. Absent, too, was the barfly who claimed to be a nephew of the Louisiana populist Huey Long, and whose habit was to greet me with the unwelcome words, "Ah, hate the British. Buy me a beer." Richard Harris Smith sat nursing a Schlitz. I recognized him from a photo issued to publicize his book, OSS, 1972. That book was a gem. I was sympathetic to its excoriation of British imperial ways, though I did wonder if it presaged an American empire. Later on, I got to know a little about Harris Smith. As a senior CIA officer, he had run the Situation Room established by the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson. He had been in charge there at the time of the questionable U.S. military intervention in the Dominican Republic's Civil War, 1965. Harris Smith was a charming, can-do kind of person. Learning of my interest in the history of the CIA, and knowing that I lived in Scotland, he proposed that we organize a joint conference on the subject of the agency's past. This would be on the Isle of Skye. Overlooked by the Killen Hills, we would plot a course leading to greater enlightenment. Perhaps Dame Flora would allow us to use Dunvegan Castle. Spurning the local smoky whiskies, we would drink Speyside's Macallan single malt. He knew it was my favorite tipple, and stated that at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, they drank nothing else. The conference that would have brought back the good old days never came to pass. In the mid-1970s, the American people and Congress rose up against the CIA's boondoggling practices. Harris Smith, a man I liked enormously, became the relic of a bygone age. The year 1975's intelligence investigations not only interrupted the flow of unvouchered funds, but also led to other reforms, such as more insistent congressional oversight. It was the first major upheaval in the CIA's history. The following chapters present an overview not only of upheavals, but also of the agency's origins, successes, and failures. This is not with the aim of supplying comprehensive coverage. America is a world power, and any attempt to cover the CIA's history in its entirety would be overambitious. Instead, in the style of an essayist, I shall look at key events. Such events, for example, the Bay of Pigs episode, will be recognizable, at least by name, to students of the American past. With the same object of making the CIA's history easier to the eye, I mainly avoid certain practices that have plagued the writing of intelligence history. They include the excessive use of acronyms. Further eschewed is the overemployment of sometimes obscure operational names. This book calls the Bay of Pigs invasion the Bay of Pigs invasion, in preference to Operation Trinidad, Operation Zapata, or Operation J-Mark. Finally, I omit that page-defacing device, the Uniform Research Locator, or URL. Observing the foregoing principles, we will expound the book's central thesis, that the agency's effectiveness had depended on its standing. The CIA's standing in the White House determined the scale of its impact. The agency struggled with other entities vying for position in the White House pecking order. Its success depended on the ability of a president to understand intelligence briefings, but also on his willingness to heed them, a function of personality and political priorities. It depended not only on the CIA's performance, but also on the communication skills of its leadership. Finally, in democratic America, the standing of the CIA was discernibly dependent on public opinion. The White House responds to public opinion because the president is an elected official. The president also heeds it indirectly because he is answerable to Congress. For members of the House and of the Senate, as for the chief executive, what shaped opinion mattered. Therefore it mattered for the CIA. For the CIA needed appropriations, the prerogative of the House of Representatives, and it needed also Senate approval of its foreign policy-affecting activities. Domestic transgressions by the agency, such as spying on students, did not go down well with Congress. What the CIA did overseas mattered less. The CIA's standing abroad is still significant, though. As one observer after another affirmed, the agency's covert actions were the greatest single cause of anti-Americanism in the post-World War II era. Those who mandated the covert operators to engage in excesses seriously damaged America's claim to be the champion of democracy. Great swathes of the world's population wanted a judicious blend of democracy, socialism, and capitalism, which was just what the United States itself had, but would not fully admit. The CIA itself was a democratically created and overseen institution, but those who guided the CIA insisted, in their designs for foreign lands, on defining and enforcing a binary choice between socialism and democracy plus capitalism. Thus, it came to pass that the agency contributed to the overthrow of democratically elected governments by covert, but only two discoverable means. In this way, the CIA eroded America's international capabilities in the vital realm of soft power. And when things came unstuck, as they regularly did, the agency suffered a loss of status in the White House that affected the credibility not just of its operators, but of their colleagues, the analysts, as well. To turn to its raison d'etre, the CIA was in good measure the creation of World War II veterans who had served with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. In a close examination of the agency's origins, we will further look at ways in which the more distant past helped to shape its mission. Well before the communist threat from the Soviet Union, UI, an organism that grew out of World War I, reflected the idea that America needed peacetime central intelligence. Thus, there pre-existed a rationale for the continuation of central intelligence in the 1990s, when the demise of European communism seemed to make the CIA redundant. That train of thought helped the CIA survive in the post-Cold War years until the second great upheaval in its existence, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. In the final section of the book, we examine the reasons for that reform, together with the reform's impact on the CIA and on U.S. intelligence performance. The legislation demoted the CIA. The agency's standing suffered further when it gained the reputation of being a machine dedicated merely to torture and assassination. Yet was that reputation deserved? There were signs of improved intelligence analysis, an improvement that was in line with a tradition that had evolved ever since the days of U1, and which survived even the turbulence of the Trump presidency. Heartfelt thanks go to Richard Aldrich, Michael Donovan, Hugh Dillon, Thomas Fingar, Christopher Fuller, John Gazavinian, Jerry Hughes, Richard Immerman, Christopher Combe, Ian Manners, Peter Riley, Priscilla Roberts, Len Scott, Gregory Treverton, Hugh Wilford, and Randall Woods for their help in researching and thinking about the history of the CIA. I am grateful also to Brown University's Charlotte Scott and her fellow student editors for constructive criticism of drafts of my prefiguring article, American Espionage, Lessons from the Past, published in the Brown Journal of World Affairs, Volume 26, Edition 1, Fall/Winter 2019, pages 18 to 29. My editor at Oxford University Press, Matthew Cotton, steered the project through a difficult time, and I am as ever appreciative of his dedication and skill. I keep promising my wife, Mary, that I am working on my last book. My good fortune is that she matches her skepticism with loving support. I reciprocate her love. This volume is devoted to Mary's courageous daughter, Effie, and to Effie's children, George and Sadie. 1. The Road to You 1. The CIA is an American institution. To understand how the agency has fared in its 75-year history, it is wise first to consider its precursors, from the earliest days of the nation to the 20th century. For while there was never anything quite like the agency before 1947, the manner of its creation, as well as its subsequent fate, reflected habits acquired and lessons learned over the 17 preceding decades. The CIA was created as an executive agency, and the issue of executive secret powers has a pedigree stretching back to the days of the Founding Fathers. In the Republic's early years, foreign threats to its very existence were so acute that Congress took a step back from democracy and invested implicit trust in President George Washington. In 1790, the legislators voted in favor of a contingent fund of foreign intercourse to enable Washington to pay his spies, allotting $40,000 in the first instance. Within 3 years, the contingency, or secret, fund had grown to $1 million, 12% of the federal budget. Washington's successors in the White House continued to pay spies from the contingency fund. They reimbursed them as individuals. Then, in 1865, President Lincoln established the nation's first spy agency. In the course of the Civil War, he had so far experienced mixed fortunes with spies. When he engaged the services of Allan Pinkerton, the private detective proved more adept at boosting his own fame than estimating the strength of Confederate forces. In the cabinet meeting before his assassination, Lincoln finally established a federal agency, the United States Secret Service. He did so by executive order and without consulting Congress, safe in the knowledge that the Union was still at war and that his judgment would have to be trusted. At first, with inflation threatening the Union's finances, the Secret Service tracked down greenback counterfeiters. When peace arrived, it switched its attention to Southern moonshiners. What brought it into the realm of political controversy was a new assignment it received in 1871 from the radical Reconstructionists. In a significant precedent, America's spies would be put to work to champion a liberal cause. The radicals in Congress wanted to deliver, in full, the newly conferred rights of millions of newly liberated African Americans. Happy to oblige them, Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman tasked the service's agents to track down the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan's elusive night riders were using brutal methods to turn back the clock of Southern history and enforce servitude. Former slave Brawley Gilmore of Union, South Carolina, remembered how heavily armed Klan horsemen would come along at night, riding de niggers like goats, and lining them up on the handrail of Turk Creek's bridge for target practice. When the Secret Service returned to their familiar Southern turf and asked for information in South Carolina, the freedman John Good saw his opportunity. He knew who the night riders in his district were, and that he could prove it. For Good was the local blacksmith, and he shod the very horses the Klan rode to terrify his kinsfolk. This gave him the opportunity to supply the Secret Service with proof. He marked the horses' hooves with bent nails so that the federal detectives could track them. The Klan worked that one out and killed John Good, but by that time he had already accomplished his mission. With the aid of such courageous individuals and of the United States Army, which still occupied swathes of the defeated South, the Secret Service crushed the Klan. Its victory was short-lived. By the end of the 1870s, the former Confederate states were back in the Union. Racism and anti-federalism received a new lease on life, striking a chord that would resonate loudly and repeatedly into the era of the CIA. Defenders of old Southern ways accused the Secret Service of being an instrument of federal oppression. Others joined in. Lodging a procedural objection to the service's budgetary appropriation, Republican Congressman Ebenezer B. Finley of Ohio demanded that the secret detectives should limit their work to that originally intended, the prevention of counterfeiting. Voicing a particularly sensitive charge, Finley accused the Secret Service of spying on his congressional colleagues. For such dubious reasons, the consensus behind the Secret Service began to disintegrate. Opposition to the instruments of clandestine power was particularly evident in the year 1893. This time, the opposition came from liberal, not conservative quarters, and such switches were to be common in the years to come. The Anti-Pinkerton Act aimed to curb the misdeeds of private detectives who impeded the activities of labor unions. Though rarely, if ever, enforced, it reflected a significant segment of opinion. American anti-imperialists also took steps to frustrate clandestinity. The Republican Senator, George F. Hoare, was prominent among those who suspected that President Grover Cleveland was using secret methods to create an American empire in which non-white inhabitants would not enjoy the rights of U.S. citizenship. When the Cleveland administration was negotiating the annexation of Hawaii in 1893, the Massachusetts senator secured passage of a resolution that came to be known as the Hoare Amendment. This allowed the president to employ a mere agent or spy to aid him in his duties, but forbade agents from conducting negotiations on behalf of the United States. By the 1890s, then, the legitimacy and standing of American espionage had been challenged from the left as well as from the right. The War of 1898 renewed national unity and helped to heal old Civil War wounds. The newfound unity meant widespread support for the Secret Service as it embarked on a counter-espionage venture. At the beginning of the war, Spain's naval attaché Ramon de Carranza fled to Montreal, where he established a spy ring. Its objectives included identification of targets up and down the east coast of the United States, for example the financial district of Philadelphia that might be bombarded by Spain's armored cruisers. Under the leadership of John E. Wilkie, the Secret Service investigated. On the 7th of May, 1898, agents arrested George Downing in the act of mailing a letter about U.S. Navy movements. Carranza described Downing as one of his two best spies. 48 hours later, Downing was found dead in his cell. Carranza conceded that he might have committed suicide, but added, "Or else they did it for him." At the time, the American press was too patriotic to pounce on that possibility. Overnight, Wilkie had become a person of standing. When he accepted an invitation to contribute to an anthology about the 1898 conflict, it was in his capacity as a war leader. He had to answer no embarrassing questions about the methods of his Secret Servicemen. Patriotic fervor died down after the war's end, and with it the harmony over the Secret Service's activities. President Theodore Roosevelt reignited white Southern antipathy. This was because he used the Secret Service to investigate peonage, a new form of slavery the planters used to keep the black population in permanent debt and servitude. Roosevelt provoked further opposition when he set the Secret Service to investigate the fraudulent sale of federal timber lands in the Pacific West, and discovered that the corruption reached all the way to Capitol Hill. Not for the best of reasons, critics once again cried out that democracy was under threat. They fastened on to the fact that Roosevelt's Attorney General, Charles Bonaparte, was the great-nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. They likened his conduct to that of Napoleon's ruthless Minister for Police, Joseph Fouché. As for Wilkie, they dubbed him a dangerous bureaucratic empire builder. Some conservatives delighted in the appearance in 1905 of Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman, which portrayed the Klan's Knight Riders as redeemers and condemned a thinly disguised Secret Service with its secret factory of testimony and powers of tampering with verdicts. Roosevelt had his defenders. The Pittsburgh Leader editorialized that the virtuous congressmen who accused the president of running a political secret service were hypocrites. They were doing a bit of secret service of their own. It is service for the trusts, the railroads, the timber thieves, and others of that class. Buoyed by such support, Roosevelt created a new Bureau of Investigation. After a number of name changes, this would be retitled in 1935 the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The president took the precaution, however, of establishing the Bureau by executive decree in a congressional adjournment. Not until 1947 would there be congressional approval of the creation of an intelligence-related agency. The early FBI, as we shall call it for convenience's sake, enjoyed some early popularity and support when it attempted to enforce the provisions of the Mann Act of 1910, an attempt to suppress the white slave trade or prostitution. Then there was a real upsurge in support for the nation's investigative agencies when World War I broke out. Working closely with British intelligence, even before America joined the war in 1917, the Secret Service pulled off some coups. For example, one day in 1915, the local New York German spy chief, Dr. Heinrich F. Albert, boarded an elevated train at 50th Street Station, New York, carrying a briefcase containing compromising documents. Secret Service agent Frank Burke, a veteran of Wilkie's team of 1898, waited until Dr. Albert had nodded off to sleep, at which point he whisked away the briefcase. Franz von Papen, military attaché in Washington and the overall organizer of German spying in America, was dismayed. The future Chancellor of Germany reportedly wrote to his wife, "Unfortunately, they stole a fat suitcase from our good friend Dr. Albert in the elevated. The English Secret Service, of course." The Secret Service had apparently fooled the Germans on this occasion, and it was generally successful in mopping up alien agents as it had been in 1898. It basked in public approval. In future years, questions would be asked about the pro-British partisanship of the Woodrow Wilson administration, but by this time the Secret Service had retreated from politically freighted work. It had assumed a narrower responsibility and one that commanded universal approval, the protection of the president and his entourage. The FBI, which in the course of World War I muscled aside its older sister to assume a more important role, would in future be the greater source of controversy. Meantime, the Wilson administration's quietest initiative had created a precedent for the CIA. President Wilson was a scholar who wanted to be informed about foreign relations. In September 1917, he would establish the Inquiry, a study group. The Inquiry scholars used open sources to prepare databases that would guide peace negotiations. Earlier than that, though, there had been a more obscure initiative. Instead of establishing an agency, President Wilson's advisers acted with supreme secrecy in setting up a Central Intelligence Unit within the State Department. At its head was Frank L. Polk, who had become counselor to the State Department in September 1915. When in July 1919 the counselor's title changed to Undersecretary of State, the clandestine unit assumed the title U-1, the term we shall use here for convenience. Its subdivisions were numbered U-2, U-3, and so on. Polk remained second in command at the old executive building until he headed the American Commission to negotiate peace in 1919 and then became acting Secretary of State. Thus, Central Intelligence spoke to power in the Woodrow Wilson years. Unlike intelligence agencies, U-1 did not, with a few notable exceptions, send covert operatives into the field. Its task was to facilitate cooperation between existing agencies, for example the Secret Service and military intelligence, to suggest and facilitate spying operations, and to communicate the results to the White House. In Eastern Europe it oversaw activities that began to eclipse in that region the achievements of the UK's more celebrated spies. They included the undercover work of Emanuel Voska, who, in violation of the Hoare Amendment, facilitated self-determination within the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was an architect of the new state of Czechoslovakia, established in the fall of 1918. America also assumed the role of paymaster for the intelligence activities of Voska's associate, W. Somerset Maugham. The English novelist had become estranged from the exalted personages who ran British intelligence, and his lover, F. Gerald Haxton, was an American who had been persecuted by the UK authorities. Sir William Wiseman, the British officer who was responsible for Anglo-American intelligence liaison, persuaded Maugham to continue his work as a spy, with the result that Maugham travelled to St. Petersburg. He delivered to both London and his new masters in Washington high-quality intelligence on the Soviet takeover of Russia. In the period of American neutrality, 1914 to 1917, military attaché Franz von Papen oversaw espionage, sabotage of Allied assets in the United States, and attempts to recruit support for Germany's cause from Irish Americans and Indian Americans who sought independence for their countries of origin. U-1 oversaw successful efforts by the Secret Service to disrupt such enterprises. The Department of State depended on trust and credibility in its dealings with foreign nations, and generally eschewed direct espionage. However, even in the period of U.S. neutrality, Secretary of State Robert Lansing took the risk of employing of agents directly. In April 1916, he created the Bureau of Secret Intelligence and placed it under the leadership of his colleague Leland Harrison. Lansing later explained that its purpose was to issue instructions to agents and to digest and analyze their reports without their going through the regular channels of departmental correspondence. The Bureau of Secret Intelligence ran its own agents. For example, it had a man in Cairo. It was a limited enterprise. At the height of its operations, the Bureau had no more than 15 agents, and like U-1, it depended on the work of others. Later, in 1916, Harrison did initiate a notable act of espionage. He guided the efforts of a team led by Secret Service agent Joseph M. Nye. This team of specialists tapped the telegraph and telephone lines of the German embassy in Washington. Nye was able to alert Lansing to Germany's forthcoming announcement on the 31st of January 1917 that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare with no safeguarding against accidental attacks on neutral shipping. Between the 3rd of February and the 1st of April, 8 American ships were lost. Berlin had calculated that this might bring the United States into the war, but that by then the stranglehold on Allied trade would have forced Britain and France to surrender. If U-boat atrocities contributed to the U.S. entry into World War I, the Zimmerman affair was the more immediate precipitant. Here, U-1.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?